Okay, so I'm going to report back on theme 3. I'm Carlos. And we just tried to summarize in a couple of slides. And please jump in if you want to add to anything I'm saying. And I'm definitely going to ask when to complement what I'm saying. So I'm just going to move there, and then you can complement. So the questions, as you remember, were around implementing mission-based industrial innovation policies, and we looked at how to bring together missions and sectors, how to manage multiple national missions and their interactions, and finally, how do we bring together different bits of governments to generate the mission solutions. So this is the summary in a nutshell. We're not going to show you the note-taking, but rather we try to do a couple of diagrams. Please. So the first thing that we discussed when we talk about missions, people were saying, like, what is it? How do we define it? And is it useful? So why do we care? And from a positive perspective of why the missions can be useful, people say, well, it is a way to incorporate legitimate demands of society at the very top level of the policy direction. So it also helps articulate challenges that cut across sectors, and it helps us identify those things that we're going to agree on because are less contentious, like good jobs. It's also a way to be more directive, to try to have critical mass when we have little money, and to be more impactful. Helps us break silos between sectors, technologies, and industries. And it also helps convince businesses that there are new areas of demand in the future. So if the government sends that signal, then the businesses can work around that. On a negative side, people say, well, not sure we understand what it means, not sure it's relevant in my context, or it might be relevant at the European level, but not so much when we're talking about small countries to define such challenges at that high level. So for example, I think there was a comment of, we have been using economic security from Vince, actually, for many years, but now are we using just to do whatever we were trying to do anyway? Is it really a mission that is well articulated or not? Government are not necessarily familiar in different governments, difficult to implement, lack of capacity. So if you're given this challenge of implementing a mission, the mission to implement a mission, it's also difficult if you don't have the capabilities. People said we're very good at articulating the missions when we have crisis, COVID, wars, not so much in normal, peaceful times. And the assumption that sectors targeted by missions exist. And please, when I'm not sure what you mean by that.
I wrote this down last minute. Caetano, you mentioned that if we think about the Mazzucato framework, which most of us think, I think, with the mission-oriented policy, actually there is one layer about intersectoral that so there is the assumption that this sector exists, and there's not really a framework to how to design sectors that do not exist. Sorry.
That's great. So there was a lot of discussion about the concept itself, is it useful, etc., and when it can be useful. Some case studies, I think we heard from Singapore said, I think Arnold mentioned, one clear mission that you've heard from government is around good jobs, and whatever it takes, around good jobs. From Germany, we heard missions around PV, battery, hydrogen with different levels of success, because it might have been a good mission to deploy in terms of the consumption of the PVs, but not necessarily on the production, that then eventually moved to China. Brazil, we heard they have defined 6 missions. Again, past experience in pharma, oil and gas, and agriculture as well. Japan, 8 missions, I think that have been defined, including what they call digital transformation and green transformation. And in Canada, and there's mind blown there, so I think the colleague mentioned that you have identified 730 missions already. So what does that mean? Right. So then, is that what we said?
They're not missions, they're mandate letter commitments that the Prime Minister has attached to each of the ministers within the federal government. And so they can be broad-based. Some have led to missions, but they're more mandate letter commitments that could give rise to something.
Great. So there's a complication there about how many is too many. But I think these 3 quotes from, I think it's one from each table actually, so kind of capture the points anyway. In any case, despite all this confusion and potential complexity around the concept, we need to translate missions into sectors. So we cannot go to the moon without the rockets. There is no missions without sectors. And someone else actually says, and this is where the problem starts. This is, I think, a Korean colleague said, this is kind of easier to agree with, but the problem starts when you start thinking about which sectors are going to implement, which subsectors, what evidence, and not worry too much about this, because this is where the real policy-making challenge starts. So then we move to the implementation. And I think there was a clear message that there's two key enablers that create this window of opportunity on whatever we want to do, especially if this is going to be cross-governmental priority that needs to be there, the finance and obviously the politics. So examples vary in different countries of who has the power in finance or which ministry. In the United States, they mention has to go through the congressional approval to have the budget. And the executive branch might look different in different countries as well, but that seems to be a common theme that those two enablers have to create a window of opportunity. Some challenges and opportunities, as we mentioned, maybe we could have too many missions that are not well understood. Governments are already burdened in their own ministries by their ongoing missions or their everyday missions. Interaction between missions. I don't know if you want to Gwen on this, on the interactions.
Yeah, I think the few people mentioned that if there are two, the missions should be one. So we had one person mention the mission should be one, and then there should be other sub-missions, and sectors should serve like the biggest mission. But then most of the times there are multiple missions. So for example, in the UK, in the UK, now there is the mission on the overarching mission on growth, but then there's a mission on the NHS on greening. So how do these missions interact, and how to prioritize one of more of them is, I think it's an open question. It came out as an open question.
Thank you, Gwen. Then relationship between government and private sector. How do we crowd in investment, cat food? There was an example from Italy about crowding in fundings at speed required. So the tax credit were given, but using the banks for this super bonus so that transferable credits are deployed quickly and the money is made available quickly for the upgrading of real estate, for green refurbishments. I think there's a point made by Jerry about there is a lot of discussion of governments trying to be more directive, but when we look at actually the data and the policies, and the OECD analysis shows that still some of the preferred instruments are very horizontal. So they're not that directive like tax incentives. You know, you give the tax incentive and you don't know exactly what it's going to. Then when it comes to innovation and the mission of scaling up new technologies, I think there was a lot of discussions here around how do we make sure that the technologies are scaled up with the required industrial capacity. Someone said in one group, when you put academics around in the table and then you talk about the mission, obviously they're going to be talking about the research challenges or the research questions, and missions means research. But then also someone said, I think it was Mike Moller, who talked about how we need to prioritize deployment as well, and the diffusion of the R&D and the, in order to actually achieve the mission, cannot stay here. And obviously, Bill Bonvillian talked a lot about the whole value chain of innovation. There was a point as well, we require non-financial infrastructure like test beds, demonstrators, etc., to scale up, and institutions in the middle. So that was just, yes, please.
Can I just add one point, because I think we don't need all the time that actually was allocated to us. So there was one point on the relation between government and the private sector that I think was touched this morning and by a number of people today about the role, given the macroeconomic framework that both in the US and Europe in most countries is now, the role, the fiscal space for government to do what it should do is very little. And so what's the relationship between government and private capital, and how the government can discipline discipline private capital. I think it's maybe a question also for the next session. There's a sort of, some authors talk about outsourcing of the green transition to the private capital, but some governments don't have the capabilities to actually discipline and, or we could say, like attaching strings to what capital does. So yeah, I think it was touched upon both this morning and during our session, so maybe we can discuss this later on.
Thank you, Wen. And I think this is the final thing, which is around evidence. And I have 5 minutes, great. So really interesting discussion here, actually, in the different tables. But obviously, what is the issue around evidence? We don't know what is successful. It might be that we implemented something, but then the government changed, and it wasn't successful because of that. It might be because we didn't have a baseline. It might be because, well, the timescales are different in different industries and different technologies. It might be that we don't have the data. People mentioned we don't have evidence on externalities and emerging sectors. And there was also very interesting discussions around, especially in some countries, there's very codified instruments and guidelines about quantitative evidence that is required, that Treasury requires or ministries require. Not so much, it was said, about qualitative evidence, things that we cannot measure right now, which means we need to talk to the real world as policymakers. Our social research is not codified. How do we do that? Especially, how do we reach out views from industry and other constituencies? I think there was an example from Canada that was very interesting. I think we spent some time talking about the need for investment in disaggregated data. So through surveys, for example, that could give us more disaggregated data at the regional, industrial, and firm level, could be run by National Statistical Office. It could, obviously, there's an obligation of countries to follow standard industry classifications, but can statistical offices do experiments with gathering disaggregated data of use to the national agencies? There was also discussion, I think, primarily from the US about national academies can help gather views from industry, have a unbiased opinion. There's this whole issue about when you talk to industry, it's going to have obvious biases. Maybe an instrument could be national academies that could be mandated to provide evidence on very specific questions, either by Congress or by the executive. Anyone from the groups would like to add to anything of any group? Is there anything else from your side? Well, you sure? Brilliant, great. Okay, cool.